I remember the day Mr. Griffins moved in. The Dell had always been a quiet place, a stretch of green fields and rolling hills where life thrived at its own leisurely pace. Folks here were predictable. Crops grew, animals grazed, and the seasons turned just as they had for generations. But when he arrived, it was as if a shadow had slipped into our little valley, settling in the folds of the earth like a hidden serpent. I'm Thomas, a simple farmer who's lived in the Dell all my life. My family has worked this land for generations, and we've always taken pride in it. There was nothing out of the ordinary about my farm until the rumors started. It began with small things, just enough to make you scratch your head and wonder if the world was playing tricks on you. My crops started growing at an unusual pace. I'm not talking about a good harvest. I mean corn stalks reaching twice their normal height in days, tomatoes swelling to the size of pumpkins. It should have been a farmer's dream, but instead, it felt like nature was out of tune, singing the wrong notes in a song I knew by heart. Then there were the animals. At first, I noticed them becoming restless, twitchy as if they sensed something that I couldn't see. Cows would bellow in the night for no reason, chickens refused to roost, and even my old border collie, Jasper, growled at the darkness as if it held some hidden danger. The other farmers didn't seem to notice anything unusual at first. But as the weeks passed, things took a darker turn. Local livestock began dying in bizarre circumstances. Goats found with their bones twisted and shattered, horses panicked to the point of collapse, their eyes wide with terror. Whispers circulated through the Dell. There were stories of strange sounds in the night and monstrous shapes glimpsed at the edge of the woods. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to investigate, had to understand what was disturbing the natural order of the valley. And that's when I began to notice Mr. Griffins more closely. He kept to himself, rarely seen outside his property except to wander the boundary lines at dusk. His land was a sprawling estate on the edge of the Dell, with a house that seemed too large for one man. I'd never seen him with any visitors. In fact, no one really knew much about him at all, where he'd come from, or why he chose our valley. That itself wasn't particularly unusual. There were other private folks in the Dell, too. But something about him set my teeth on edge. It wasn't just his reclusive nature. It was the way he'd look at the farm animals when he thought no one was watching, the way his eyes glinted like polished steel in the light of the setting sun. My suspicions grew, along with my unease. One night, I decided to do something I'd never imagined myself doing. I went to his estate. There was no real plan in my head, just a gut feeling that I needed to see his land up close. I took Jasper along, both for the company and because he seemed to know things about the world that I didn't. We crept along the fence line as the moon hung low and full in the sky, spilling its pale light over the fields. Jasper's ears were flat against his head, his growls low and cautious. That should have been my first clue to turn back. But I kept going. The land around Griffins' estate was unlike any I'd seen. His fields were overgrown with thick, twisting vines that pulsed with life. It was as if the very soil had become some kind of breeding ground for something. I reached out to touch one of the vines, and as my hand drew near, the tendrils twitched away from me. I jerked my hand back, a shudder crawling up my spine. Then I saw the barn. It was enormous, far larger than any barn I'd ever seen, with strange markings carved into the wood. The whole structure seemed to hum with a low vibration that I could feel in my bones. I approached cautiously, peering through the gap in the door. Inside, I glimpsed something that would haunt me from that night forward. The animals. Or at least, they used to be animals. Twisted forms lay upon the straw, their bodies fused together in grotesque ways, as if nature had turned on itself and molded them into nightmarish shapes. As I stood there, frozen in horror, I heard a voice behind me. Soft and almost amused. Out for a stroll, Thomas? I spun around to find Mr. Griffins standing there, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his eyes boring into me with an unsettling calmness. There was no anger, no shock at my trespass, only a cold curiosity. I stammered out some excuse about looking for a lost calf, but he just nodded, a knowing smile twitching at the corner of his lips. "Be careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night has its own dangers. Sometimes it's best not to know." I left his estate that night with a cold sweat trickling down my neck and an even colder dread settling in my gut. I had to find out what he was doing on that farm. But the more I looked into Mr. Griffins, the less I found. It was as if he'd appeared from nowhere, with no history and no past. I started keeping a closer watch on my own farm, fearing what might happen next. The crops continued to grow at their unnatural rate, and the animals grew more restless by the day. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. And then, one night it did. I woke to Jasper's frantic barking. Grabbing my shotgun, I rushed outside to find him circling a spot near the barn, his hackles raised. I followed his gaze to a twisted mass in the grass. It was one of my goats. Or at least, what was left of it. Its limbs were stretched and twisted, its eyes bulging from its skull as if it had seen something unimaginable in its final moments. I knelt beside it, feeling the dread wash over me like a cold wave. There were tracks nearby. Hoof prints, but not like any animal I knew. They were elongated, with deep grooves that suggested claws. I followed the trail, which led right up to the edge of Mr. Griffins's property before vanishing into the thick brush. That was no coincidence. The next day, I rode into town to speak with the sheriff. I told him about the strange happenings, the livestock deaths, and Mr. Griffins's odd behavior. But he just gave me a weary look and shook his head. "Thomas," he said, "people talk. But we can't go accusing a man without proof." I could tell he thought it was nothing more than rural paranoia, but I knew better. The Dell was changing, and whatever was causing it was connected to that man. Mr. Griffins had secrets. Dark, twisted secrets. And if I didn't find out what they were soon, I feared there would be more than just animals lying dead in the grass. And so, my search for the truth began in earnest. I was just a simple farmer, a man of the earth, but I would uncover whatever evil had taken root in the Dell, even if it cost me everything. Because in the silence of the night, under the cold gaze of the moon, I could still hear Mr. Griffins's words echoing in my mind. Sometimes it's best not to know. But I had to know. I had to.